Hello and welcome to week 2, topics 3 and 4. I believe this week is chapters 28 and 29. So I want to take a quick, hopefully quick few minutes and just kind of walk through some highlights of these chapters for you and introduce the week. So we get into chapter 28. We're going to attach suffixes now to the imperfect, imperative, and the infinitive constructs. So last week we were attaching suffixes to the perfect. Now we're going to attach suffixes to the other verbal tenses. And with the imperfect, there's a few things that we want to get down. The steps are going to be very similar. We've got to know the protoform. We want to establish the accent, and then we need to know what vowel reduction pattern that we're going to use. If you remember in the perfect, we typically were using noun reduction pattern. With the lengthening in a pretonic open position. But then we also had the PL where we reduced the R2 to a vocal schwa, similar to what we had in a vocalic ending situation previously. With the protoforms of the imperfect, it's going to be pretty standard here, where we have a holum, the O class thematic vowel. We're going to reduce that, or shorten it rather, to a kametz hatuf. Where we have a serre, we're going to shorten that to a hirik, and where we have a patach, we're going to leave a patach. We very rarely, if ever, have a long kametz a in the thematic vowel position, and so we're going to get the patach to patach. Short vowels in Proto are short vowels in Biblical Hebrew. It's going to be good at this point if you kind of start thinking, if you haven't already, start thinking of Hebrew vowels in 3 classes rather than 5. So in English we have A, E, I, O, U, 5 vowel classes. In Hebrew it's best to think of 3 vowel classes. We have the A vowel class, the E, I vowel class, and then the O, U vowel class. Excuse me. So if you can think about those vowel classes, it'll help a little bit. With something like this instance where we have the serre reducing to a hirik, we have an E reducing to, or shortening rather, to an I. But that's totally fine, because in Hebrew they think of the vowel class as an EI vowel class, not an I and then an E as we do in English. So there's your proto forms. We're going to simply go back to proto in this case by shortening the non-historic long vowels. As it relates to the accents, the heavy endings, 2MP, 2FP, and then also the 2MS are going to pull the accent to the end of the word, except for in that one instance there where we have a historic long vowel at the end. The R3 will still be accented there. So heavy endings pull the accent. All other forms are going to accent the R3. So kind of keep that in mind as you're working through these. And then when we get to vowel reduction patterns, we're going to distinguish between the O and E vowels and then the A vowels. Okay, OE vowels, so holum and serre, OE verbs, I guess we could say, are going to use the verb reduction pattern. So we're going to get that R2 reducing to a vocal schwa. It gives you an example there with the 3MS imperfect and the 1CS suffix. A-class vowels with a patach, or A-class verbs, we are going to lengthen. So we're going to use the noun reduction pattern here. Lengthen a pretonic open, and then if we have anything pro-pretonic, we're going to reduce that to a vocal schwa as well. So vowel reduction patterns, I'll let you work through those. Again, I just want to highlight some things for you. Here's a quick example. Call imperfect 3FS plus a 3MS of katal. I've given you the vowel there is A in the perfect, and then we're going to be O in the imperfect imperative. So we're looking at an O class vowel here. We take our holum in this R2 and reduce it, shorten it to the kametz hatuf. Then we're going to attach the box and establish the accent. Our box in this case for the 3MS is ehu, and we're going to accent the R3. This is very normal without a heavy ending. Verb reduction pattern here, because we have an O class imperfect. We are going to reduce the R2, so you can see there the orange tet with the vowel reduced. We went from a Comet Satuf short vowel to a vocal schwa. Any specific problems in this case? There are none, and so there's our answer. Okay, so good quick review there. Moving to the imperative, the issue here now is going to be your protoform. So pay attention to these and notice that they are different. We need to decide whether we're looking at an O class or an A class. That's going to help us with the protoform, but then even in the O class we get a couple of different options here. You can see the 2ms imperative, we get cotal, very similar to what we had in the seglet nouns. But then in the 2fs 2mp we get this catol option. Now with the 2fs 2mp, this may just seem random and odd, but keep in mind these are related oops, I had this wrong. Anyway, these are related in the way that we formed the imperatives. If you remember, when we form the imperatives, we lop off the performative, and then if we need to have a schwa fight, we do. In this case, these are the two verbs that that do that in the imperative, that have that schwa fight. So these two are related. I have the arrows on this first one going the wrong direction, but we have the two schwas kitli that moves to kitli. And then also, if you remember, the two schwas kitlu in the 2mp, that becomes kitlu. So this may seem random that these two take an odd protoform or a different protoform, but keep in mind that they are related in that capacity. So with the imperatives, be sure to establish the correct protoform, and then everything else is just hunky-dory. With the accents, the imperatives are going to accent the R3. Pretty standard there. And then the OE, again, we're going to distinguish between an OE thematic vowel. They're going to reduce the verbal reduction pattern. A thematic vowels are going to lengthen. Nothing crazy there, so just remember to get those under your belt. With the infinitive constructs, again, protoforms are going to be important. We do have a couple of different protoforms, so again, get these protoforms under your belt, because if you start correctly, you're going to be fine. If you start incorrectly, then the rest is going to be a little bit off. The normal for the infinitive construct is this cotal, which is very similar again to these seglet forms. Notice here that it is possible that you will have infinitive constructs and imperatives both as options for parsings, since they're going to have a similar look. These are the two that do cross over most often when we have multiple parsing options. The infinitive construct and the imperatives will often be what those multiple options are. Heavy suffixes, we're going to use a different protoform. Again, the 2ms, 2mp, 2fp, where we pull that accent to the end. For boxes in the infinitive construct, keep in mind that infinitives are verbal nouns. So we are going to go back to chapter 12 now and use the noun boxes. This is going to be one of the areas that we can make a distinction between an imperative or an infinitive when parsing, is to look at the boxes. If we're using noun boxes, it's probably an infinitive. If we're using verbal boxes, then it's probably an imperative. So keep that in mind too. Remember which set of boxes to use. As far as special problems here, keep an eye on these as always, like I've mentioned. But these are not super difficult, just something to point out to you that the 1CS does have a variant box. So sometimes you'll see either of those boxes. The Hirik Yod there looks more like the noun box we're familiar with in chapter 12. The Ani box there looks more what we're familiar with in the verbal box chapter, I guess 27 and 28. So keep that in mind. There is a variant form. I will mention this multiple times, but again, in Hebrew, we are trying to describe what the language does and then learn how it works. We aren't trying to prescribe it. So when we get to these specific problems, we basically have to just say, hey, in the Hebrew text, we do see this difference. We do see these variant boxes, so we have to account for them. They are specific problems. They are variants, they are anomalies, if you want to call them that, but at the same time, it's how Hebrew works. It's how the Hebrew Bible is written, so we need to account for it. Also, the variant forms of the 2MS, 2MP. Again, this is just what we see in the Hebrew Bible, so we need to account for it. But I won't ask you to give me all of these variant forms if by chance they show up on a quiz. I'll just ask you to give me one of the two variant forms. So keep those in mind. I've got another box. There it is. Got a little ahead of myself. Attaching suffixes then to the derived stems, PL, also the hith-pael falls with that one, and then the hifil, very similar to the previous chapter. We're going to reduce the R2, and the infinitive construct takes noun boxes. Both of these points are completely normal stuff we've seen before. In the hifil, again, we have quite normal issues here. The theme vowel in the hifil doesn't reduce because it's a hiric yod. It's a historic long. We can't touch that. And then also, this is the one that's a little bit different. The imperative 2ms, if you remember in the hifil, is a sere form. However, with suffixes, it takes a hiric yod, and so it doesn't reduce. So that's going to be a little bit different than what we've seen before, but keep an eye on that. With Chapter 28, the assignments, we're doing drill sheets 1 and 2, and then the chapter quiz. A couple of reminders here. Only doing the odd drills, okay? We're not going to do all of those 2 drill sheets. I want you to just do the odd ones of both the creates and the parses. Remember to show all your work on separate paper, grade that, put the number you missed at the top of the page, and then submit those to the links, preferably with a scanned PDF if you can, okay? Chapter 29, we get into the weak verb. Now, this is going to be the place where we start to get a little messy. Weak verbs basically are described as any verb that has, I was getting ready to say a weakness, but the weaknesses typically revolve around the gutturals, the guttural letters. Also, the noon tends to be a weak letter. You can see there the R or the number 6. We're going to look at R1 noons later. You've seen the noons assimilate before into the following letter, and that's what we get. Sometimes the noons just fly away altogether, but those tend to be weak letters. Also, the vav yods tend to be weak letters, and we'll get into those a little bit later. But a lot of this is going to relate to gutturals, and we'll address those first, particularly with the R1 guttural. And I want to talk a second about this language, the pay guttural. This is the pay guttural is one of those, or I want to talk about this terminology, okay? So when we have a pay guttural, and you may have seen this, this is what a lot of people will call it, it's related to the verb pa'al. We get this pay here in the R1. So when we talk about an R1 guttural, some people will talk about a pay guttural. It's the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. And if you remember kind of how we've designated all of our stems, PL, PUAL, HITH, PAEL, they are related to this PAAL pedagogical word. So this is just the word that the Hebrews used to describe these verbal stems. So you can see here I've spelled PL. Now it hurts my heart to put that dagesh in that ayin, but again, just as a teaching tool, this is what we've used. Also, hith pa'el, right? You see how we basically spell these words based on the pa'al root. Hof al, there you go. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about pay gutturals, you'll hear ayin gutturals, you'll hear lamed gutturals. We're going to talk about those as R1, R2, R3. But again, I want you to know that terminology if you see it elsewhere. Weaknesses of the R1 gutturals, we have a dagesh forte issue. Now, this issue is going to include the resh, because remember, reshes act like a guttural as it relates to the dagesh forte. They are going to reject that dagesh forte, so keep that in mind. We have a vocal schwa problem. This is going to exclude resh because reshes can take a vocal schwa. It's not a problem for them, so they'll just keep that no problem. And then we have the silent schwa issue that we're going to address with gutturals that will flip from a silent schwa to a vocal composite schwa. This is also normal. We've seen this in the guttural characteristics in chapter 5. Also, we've seen this in the seglets with gutturals, that they flipped from a composite or a simple silent schwa to a composite. So this is not going to be completely new to us. We just have to know where to put it. And then the gutturals that take a silent schwa often will just accept it. It's no problem. But they will still change the preformative vowel, and you'll see those in the video with Dr. Fuller, and I might show you one of those here in a minute. So remedying these guttural weaknesses, let's look at the Dagesh forte first. Here's a normal strong verb, yishamer. This is our Nifal 3ms. And we have the guttural there in the R1 completely normal with a sheen. When we get the R1 guttural in, we're going to reject that and get compensatory lengthening of the preformative vowel. So again, nothing completely abnormal for us. When we reject that Dagesh, we get compensatory lengthening. We saw that in the addition of the article. And so nothing terribly new there, but again, just keep that in mind. As it relates to remedying the vocal schwa, this is also not completely new to us. I'm assuming you can see that there, but the strong verb ketov, we have that vocal schwa in the R1. When we have an R1 guttural, we're going to flip that to a composite. With the ayin, we're typically going to get a composite hadef patah. With the aleph, we're going to typically get a hadef segol. It is a good general rule to keep in mind that the aleph will often take a segol sound of some sort, and this is not this is new to us necessarily. If you remember the imperfect paradigm, we have ektol at the very beginning. With that aleph performative, we get the segol. So alephs don't always take the segols, but a lot of times they do. And in this case, with the R1 guttural vocal schwa issue, they do. So there's that one. And then with the silent schwa issue, this is going to be the one that starts to get a little messy for us, particularly in the call. But generally, if a silent schwa falls under an R1 guttural, the guttural in the R1 position will take the composite schwa that corresponds to the performative vowel. And so here are those listed out from the chapter. In the strong verb there with a patah under the performative, if we get the R1 guttural avir, ya avir, we're going to get the corresponding hadef patah because our performative is a patah. Moving to the next one, we have the segol. Again, remember the EI vowel class. We have niktol that becomes ne'ezav. So we don't have a hadef hirik composite schwa, so we have to move to the hadef composite schwa that we have in that vowel class, which is the E. Okay, and then in the O vowel class we have hoktal that becomes no'ozav. And he may have intended to put a hey on there as ho'ozav. I don't know. I don't know why the noon pops in there, but either way, you can see the vowels, the silent schwa flipping to a composite. When it changes to the composite, it becomes the composite of the corresponding preformative vowel. As it relates to the call imperfect, we're looking to see if we have a segol or a patah. Which one is it? Which do we use? We're going to use a segol when we have the first common singular, which is the aleph performative. Again, this reminds us of our call paradigm, ektol. The aleph likes to take that hadef segol, so evor is what we have here. Also with verbs in the stative and the standard that have a patah thematic vowel, we get ye'echav as the example there. This is also not completely abnormal to us to have that ea sound roll, the ea sound roll. If you remember furtive patahs, we often get those after a serre in the R2. in order to get that A sound. We also had the AI sound when we attached the article to nouns that have a het with a kametz, and then an unaccented hey and ayin with a kametz. We got the segol underneath the article in order to make that AI sound. So this is not super abnormal as it relates to the phonetics of Hebrew, but it may just look odd. And you can, if you want to just memorize patach thematic vowels, we get the segol in that performative and underneath the guttural as the composite. And then also, again, all standard. What he means by standard is they take an O thematic vowel. R1 aleph verbs. Again, there's our aleph, wanting that segol, the 5-star general. That's a good general rule to think of. With the call imperfect, we're going to get the patach composite under the R1 guttural. When we have a hey, het, or ayin. Also with standard verbs that have a aleph that's non-pausal. Now let me talk for just a second about this non-pausal thing. Typically, I think I have an example here. Yeah, here we go. So here's the example that he gave you, ya'achru. This one with the vocalic ending, we reduced the R2 to a vocal schwa. That's completely normal to us, ya'achru. And what he means by pause is typically when a verb is in pause, what that means is it takes a heavy disjunctive accent, something like an athnach. When that happens, this R2 will typically not reduce because it's in pause and has a hard disjunctive accent. The verb will retain the original thematic vowel. And in this case, I've left it as an A. I honestly don't know which one it would be. It's probably an O if that's the standard, but either way, the example I give you is an A. So if this verb were not in pause, or if it were in pause, it would look something like this. We would have that athnach and the retention of the thematic vowel A. And because it's in pause, we would get then the segols because of the R1 aleph. But if you look at the example there, he gives you in number 2, it's going to be R1 alephs, gutturals, that are non-pausal. This one is pause, so we get the segols instead of the patach. So again, it's kind of an odd form there, an odd thing to remember, but you probably won't see many of these. But again, we're describing what happens. This would be the case there. So email me if you have questions about that. But for the most part, you're going to be looking at number 1 there with you're going to get the A with hey, hets, and ayins in the R1. Okay. Now, as it relates to remedies for the silent schwa, R1 gutturals sometimes retain the silent schwa, but the performative vowel changes as if the composite schwa had replaced the silent schwa. He gives you a couple of examples here. The one that he gives you there at the beginning, nech ba, we have retained the silent schwa in the het, but if you'll notice, the nifal performative hirik has changed to a segol, as if we had flipped the hadif, or flipped the silent schwa to a hadif segol, necheba. But in this instance, it did not retain it, or sorry, it did not flip it. It retained the silent schwa, but we still changed the performative. So this is going to be a little bit something to keep an eye on. Again, remember the vowel classes EI for Hebrew, so that nifal hirik became a segol, nechba. And then we've also chunked the dagesh lene into that bait in the R2, so keep that in mind as well. Likewise with the call imperfect 3ms, typically we would have created it as a strong verb as yichtom, but because of that R1 guttural, typically the het in strong verbs and in O-class verbs would take a hadif patach. We would typically have yachatom, but we don't. If it retains the silent schwa in this case, we get the change in the performative, but not the change in the R1 guttural, so we're left with Yach tome. So again, keep that in mind. He mentions at the bottom here there are some exceptions. These are general rules, but again, sometimes the R1 guttural may retain that silent schwa. When it does, the performative still changes. I think that's all that I wanted to say on that one. So there you go. Chapter 29 assignments. We've got drill sheets 1 and 2. Again, do just the odds. And then the chapter quiz for this one. Remember on the chapter quizzes that I want you to do just the last two sections, the create and parse section and the vocabulary section. So these may be cumulative, but those are the only two sections that I want you to do for the quizzes. Remember also they are closed book, and let's see, closed book, and what else was I going to tell you about those? Oh, the proctor forms. So be sure and actually, I don't think I have proctor forms for you guys. If I don't, sorry about that. But remember, the quizzes are closed book, and take those with integrity. Let me know if you have any questions. Would love to help you guys. Have a great week.